Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Woman Israel Waited For, the untold story of Miriam. Please support the channel with a like and subscription. The content of this video has been compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. What if one of the most important figures in the Exodus story was never Moses, not Aaron, but a woman the Bible mentions only in fragments, a girl standing silently beside the Nile, a prophet leading a nation in song, a leader bold enough to challenge Moses himself, and a woman so important that an entire nation stopped moving until she returned. Miriam is often remembered as Moses' sister, but that description may hide far more than it reveals. Because when you pull together the scattered biblical clues, historical context, and centuries of interpretation, a very different picture begins to emerge. This is not the story of a side character. This is the story of one of the most powerful, mysterious, and overlooked women in all of biblical history. When most people think about the Exodus story, three images usually come to mind. Moses standing before Pharaoh, Moses parting the Red Sea, Moses descending from Sinai with the law of God. Even those with only a passing familiarity with the Bible tend to recognize Moses as the towering human figure of Israel's deliverance. Some may also remember Aaron, the brother who became Israel's first high priest, but far fewer remember Miriam. And when they do, she is often reduced to a simple description, Moses' sister. Yet, that label, while technically true, may be one of the most misleading simplifications in biblical storytelling, because buried across scattered passages of Scripture, prophetic references, and centuries of Jewish interpretation is evidence that Miriam was not merely a background family member in the Exodus drama. She may have been one of its central architects. The first challenge in reconstructing Miriam's story is that the biblical text does not present her in a straightforward biographical narrative, unlike Moses, whose life receives extended narrative treatment. Miriam appears in fragments, a brief appearance here, a title there, a controversy later, a death notice that seems almost shockingly brief. This fragmented presentation has caused many readers to underestimate her significance, but ancient texts often work differently from modern biographies. Importance is not always measured by screen time. Sometimes a single line can reveal immense status. One of the most important clues appears not in Exodus, but much later, in the prophetic book of Micah. In Micah 6:4, God declares, "I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam." That sentence deserves careful attention. Miriam is not described merely as Moses' relative. She is listed alongside Moses and Aaron as one of the figures God sent before Israel. In other words, the biblical tradition itself remembers Miriam as part of the official leadership of the nation. That alone should force us to rethink everything. Because if Miriam was truly regarded as one of the divinely appointed leaders of Israel's foundational liberation story, why is she so often treated as secondary? Part of the answer may lie in how stories get remembered. Large narratives tend to collapse around dominant heroic figures. Moses naturally became the central character because of his unmatched role as lawgiver, prophet, and mediator between God and Israel. But that does not mean others were unimportant. In fact, the Exodus story repeatedly shows that deliverance was not the work of one person. It was a chain of courage involving multiple actors, many of them women. Before Moses ever confronted Pharaoh, before the plagues, before Sinai, before the sea, survival itself depended on women who resisted imperial violence. Miriam belongs to that story. Even her name carries mystery. Scholars have debated the meaning of Miriam for generations. Some connect it to Hebrew roots associated with bitterness. a possible symbolic echo of Israel's suffering in Egypt. Others suggest meanings related to rebellion, though that interpretation remains debated. Still others note possible Egyptian linguistic connections, which would make sense given the cultural environment of the Exodus narrative. The truth is that no single explanation commands universal scholarly agreement. That uncertainty is important because it reminds us of something essential about ancient history. Not everything is recoverable with precision. Responsible historical analysis means distinguishing what is firmly grounded from what remains interpretive. That principle will guide this entire journey, because the story of Miriam sits at the intersection of scripture, history, tradition, and later interpretation. Some details are explicit in the biblical text. Others emerge through historical reconstruction. Still others belong to Jewish interpretive memory rather than canonical scripture itself. Understanding those distinctions matters if we want truth rather than mythology. Historically, Miriam belongs to one of the most difficult and debated narrative worlds in the Hebrew Bible. The Exodus account exists within a framework that combines theological storytelling, national memory, and historical claims that scholars continue to examine intensely. Questions about chronology, Egyptian context, historical corroboration, and textual development remain subjects of major academic discussion. But regardless of where one lands on broader Exodus historicity debates, Miriam functions within the biblical tradition as a real and significant leadership figure. Her presence is not incidental. She appears in moments of national crisis, worship, conflict, and communal memory. That pattern matters. Another reason Miriam is often overlooked is because ancient narratives frequently gave women less narrative space even when they exercised meaningful influence. Yet the Hebrew Bible contains several striking female figures who emerge with undeniable authority. Deborah serves as judge and prophet. Huldah delivers divine revelation to royal officials. Esther alters imperial policy. Ruth becomes central to Israel's royal lineage. Miriam belongs within this broader biblical landscape of female significance, though her role may be even more foundational because she stands near the birth of Israel's national identity itself. What makes Miriam especially compelling is that she is not presented as a flawless saint. Biblical storytelling rarely works that way. Its major figures are often deeply human, capable of courage and failure alike. Moses himself doubts, protests, and disobeys. Aaron participates in the golden calf disaster. David commits devastating moral failures. Miriam, too, will eventually appear in a moment of controversy that raises difficult theological questions, but that complexity makes her more historically believable, not less. Real leadership is rarely simple. Real human beings are rarely one-dimensional. And perhaps that is why Miriam matters so much. She represents something often lost in simplified retellings of biblical history, the truth that history is not built by solitary heroes alone. It is shaped by networks of courage, loyalty, resistance, conflict, and faith. Miriam stands at the beginning of that story, a woman remembered not only as a sister, but as a prophet. Not only as a witness, but as a leader. Not only as a participant, but as someone an entire nation once recognized as essential. The question is not whether Miriam mattered. Scripture itself already answers that. The real question is how much of her story we have failed to notice. Long before Miriam was called a prophet, before she would stand before an entire nation with tambourine in hand, before conflict and controversy would shape her legacy, she may have already changed history as a child. The biblical text introduces this moment with terrifying simplicity. A new pharaoh rises in Egypt, one who sees the growing Hebrew population not as human beings, but as a political threat. In Exodus, Fear becomes policy. Oppression intensifies. Forced labor becomes the machinery of control. But eventually, even exploitation is no longer enough. Pharaoh orders something far darker: the destruction of Hebrew male infants. This is not merely cruelty, it is demographic warfare. A calculated attempt to erase a people's future while preserving their labor force. Female children are allowed to live, likely because they were perceived as less politically threatening in the patriarchal assumptions of the ancient world. Ironically, that assumption becomes one of Pharaoh's greatest strategic failures, because the Exodus story begins with women refusing to cooperate with empire. Hebrew midwives defy the royal command. Moses' mother hides her son. Pharaoh's own daughter subverts her father's decree, and between them stands a young girl watching from the riverbank. Exodus 2 tells the story with remarkable restraint. Moses' mother places the infant in a basket among the reeds by the Nile, a desperate act balancing surrender and hope. Then the text says that his sister stood at a distance to know what would happen to him. The girl is not named in this moment. Only later biblical genealogy identifies Moses' siblings, and long-standing Jewish and Christian tradition overwhelmingly recognizes this unnamed sister as Miriam, while the text itself introduces her anonymously here. The identification is historically well established within interpretive tradition. What matters immediately is not simply who she is, but what she does. It is tempting in modern retellings to imagine this as a passive child witnessing events beyond her control, but the narrative suggests something far more intelligent and deliberate. She is not described as hiding in panic. She is watching intentionally. She is assessing. She is waiting for an opportunity. Then comes the extraordinary turning point. Pharaoh's daughter discovers the child. She recognizes him as Hebrew. The political implications should be obvious. This infant belongs to the population her father has ordered targeted, yet compassion intervenes. At precisely that moment, the girl steps forward and speaks. "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" This is one of the most strategically brilliant moments in the early Exodus narrative. Think carefully about what has happened. A child standing at the edge of state violence recognizes a fleeting opportunity and acts instantly. She does not freeze. She does not react emotionally. She offers a practical solution that allows Moses' biological mother to be brought back into the situation under royal protection. The genius is astonishing. Pharaoh's own household ends up financing the preservation of the very child who will later confront Egyptian power. Whether Miriam fully understood the future implications is impossible to know. The text does not suggest prophetic foresight at this stage, but it absolutely suggests courage, intelligence, and composure under pressure. This matters because it reframes Miriam from the beginning. She is not introduced as incidental family background. She enters the biblical story through decisive action. Some scholars note that the women in these opening Exodus chapters function almost as a collective resistance movement against imperial death. Pharaoh issues commands, but women repeatedly undermine them. The Hebrew midwives preserve life. Moses' mother engineers survival. Pharaoh's daughter adopts compassion over obedience. And Miriam serves as the tactical bridge connecting danger to deliverance. In literary terms, this is profound. Before Moses becomes the liberator, he must first be liberated, and that liberation is accomplished not through male leadership, military force, or divine plagues, but through the courage and ingenuity of women. Historically, the story also reflects deeper realities of ancient power structures. Royal decrees in authoritarian systems often depended on widespread compliance. Resistance could take dramatic or subtle forms. Open rebellion was dangerous. Quiet subversion could be more effective. Miriam's intervention fits that pattern. not as organized political revolution in the modern sense, but as localized moral resistance within oppressive structures. Of course, responsible analysis requires acknowledging uncertainty. We do not know Miriam's exact age in this scene. Many artistic depictions imagine her as a small child, but the biblical text does not specify. Her speech and initiative may suggest someone old enough to think strategically and interact confidently with elite authority. Whether young, adolescent, or older, the essential point remains unchanged. She acts with remarkable presence of mind. Another fascinating layer lies in the symbolism of the Nile itself. In Egyptian civilization, the Nile represented life, fertility, and national identity. Yet here it becomes both threat and unexpected pathway of salvation. The same river associated with Pharaoh's power becomes the route through which his policy is undermined. And standing at that symbolic intersection is Miriam, watching, waiting, acting. This is also the first hint of a recurring pattern in her story. Miriam appears repeatedly at moments of transition, at thresholds between danger and survival, between silence and leadership, between family intimacy and national significance. She is often not the loudest figure in the narrative, but her interventions occur at structurally critical moments. Without this scene, the Exodus story looks radically different. No preserved infant Moses, no prince raised within Egyptian structures, no later confrontation with Pharaoh, no Sinai, no Red Sea crossing as we know it. Of course, theology would frame history through divine sovereignty, not human contingency alone. But biblical storytelling consistently portrays divine purposes unfolding through human choices. Miriam's choice matters. What makes this moment especially powerful is that history would likely have remembered none of it if the biblical tradition had not preserved this brief encounter. One unnamed sister, a few lines of text, yet those lines may describe one of the most consequential acts of courage in biblical history, because before Miriam led a nation in worship, before she challenged prophetic authority, before an entire people waited for her recovery, she was simply a girl beside a river who refused to stand still while history unfolded without her. To understand Miriam as a leader, we first have to understand the world that shaped her. One of the biggest mistakes in biblical storytelling is filling narrative silence with fiction. Scripture tells us surprisingly little about Miriam's private early life. We are not given scenes of her childhood conversations, her personal dreams, or detailed memories of family life in Egypt. And responsible historical storytelling must resist the temptation to invent what the text does not provide. But while the Bible is largely silent about Miriam's personal development, it says much more about the world around her. And sometimes environment explains as much as biography. Miriam was born into a world defined by oppression, fear, labor, ethnic vulnerability, and survival under imperial power. The Exodus narrative opens not with heroic deliverance, but with demographic anxiety. A new pharaoh looks at the growing Hebrew population and sees danger. Whether the historical setting corresponds to a precise, identifiable Egyptian dynasty remains debated among scholars, but the literary world of Exodus is unmistakable. Israel exists as an ethnically distinct laboring population, living under increasingly hostile state control. Pharaoh's concern is not theological, it is political. He fears numbers, potential alliances, and instability. In ancient empires, minority populations could easily be viewed as strategic threats, especially during periods of insecurity. The response is classic authoritarian policy. First labor exploitation, then intensified oppression, then state-sanctioned violence. Exodus describes forced labor, construction demands, bitter service, and eventually infanticidal decree. This is the atmosphere into which Miriam enters history.
That matters because leadership does not emerge in abstraction. It emerges in response to conditions. If Miriam later became resilient, decisive, and politically aware, the environment itself helps explain why. Historical reconstruction must be approached carefully here. The biblical text presents theological history, not modern social ethnography, but broader knowledge of ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian society allows certain cautious observations. Egypt was one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, marked by monumental architecture, centralized administration, stratified social hierarchy, and powerful religious symbolism. For subordinated labor populations, life could be harsh and tightly controlled. Exactly how the Exodus narrative maps onto reconstructible Egyptian labor systems remains debated, but coercive labor as an imperial instrument is historically unsurprising. For Hebrew communities within this framework, identity preservation would have been a constant challenge. Empires do not merely control bodies, they shape memory, language, custom, naming practices, economic dependency, and social adaptation all create pressures toward assimilation. That is partly why Miriam's own name generates scholarly debate. Some propose Hebrew roots, others suggest Egyptian linguistic influence. The uncertainty itself reflects cultural complexity. Families living for generations within imperial systems often carry blended cultural markers. This does not mean lost identity. It means survival inside layered realities. Another critical dimension concerns women. Modern readers often flatten ancient women into passive domestic stereotypes, but the biblical world is more complex. Women's legal rights, social visibility, and institutional authority varied dramatically by culture, class, and context. In Egypt, women in some social strata could hold property and exercise legal agency more visibly than in some neighboring societies. But that does not mean life was easy for vulnerable minority women under oppressive conditions. Hebrew women in Exodus are repeatedly shown navigating survival under extraordinary pressure. They protect children, negotiate danger, and make life-preserving decisions under systemic threat. Miriam belongs to that pattern. Family memory would also have mattered profoundly. According to biblical tradition, the Israelites were not simply an ethnic group with shared ancestry. They were a covenant people, heirs to promises associated with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Whether individual households preserved those traditions with equal clarity is impossible to know. But the Exodus narrative assumes collective memory of identity distinct from Egypt. That creates a powerful psychological tension. Imagine living inside the wealth and symbolism of one of the world's great civilizations while being told you belong elsewhere. Imagine growing up surrounded by Egyptian power while hearing ancestral stories about divine promise. That kind of identity tension forms resilient communities. It can also form strong leaders. Religion in this world was not a compartment of life. It structured reality itself. Egyptian civilization was saturated with divine symbolism, ritual order, sacred kingship, and cosmic ideology. Pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He embodied political and religious significance. Resistance to such a system was not merely political defiance. It carried cosmic implications within that worldview. The Exodus story frames Israel's liberation, partly as confrontation between divine claims. That larger environment helps explain why later leadership in Israel required both political courage and theological conviction. Miriam's eventual prophetic identity becomes far more intelligible against this backdrop. Scarcity and vulnerability also shape communities. Oppressed populations become highly attentive to survival signals. Trust networks matter. Kinship matters. Strategic thinking matters. People learn when to remain silent and when to act. That context makes Miriam's intervention in the Moses infancy story even more impressive. It was not simply individual cleverness. It emerged from a world where alertness could mean survival. We should also acknowledge uncertainty about chronology. The biblical narrative compresses vast historical experience into focused storytelling, generational timelines, historical synchronisms, and archaeological correlations remain deeply debated in academic scholarship. Some scholars read Exodus primarily as theological memory shaped later in Israel's history. Others argue for stronger historical grounding behind core traditions. This documentary does not require resolving every academic dispute. What matters for our purposes is understanding the world the text constructs around Miriam, a world of oppression, identity, struggle, and fragile hope. And perhaps that is the most important point. Miriam did not emerge from comfort. She did not grow inside stable institutions built for her success. She came from a people under pressure, inside a civilization not fully their own, in a world where children could become political targets. That environment does not automatically produce leaders. It can just as easily produce fear, silence, or survival withdrawal, which makes what comes later more remarkable. Miriam does not disappear into anonymity. She rises, not instantly, not through romanticized destiny, but through a pattern the biblical narrative gradually reveals: presence in crisis, leadership in worship, voice in conflict, national significance in communal memory. To understand the woman, we must first understand the furnace that formed her. By this point in the story, Miriam has already appeared as the sharp-minded girl who helped preserve Moses' life, and we have explored the harsh world that shaped her. But now we arrive at a far more consequential question. Who exactly did Miriam become in Israel's national story? Because if most modern audiences remember her at all, they often remember fragments. Moses' sister, the woman with the tambourine, the figure later punished in controversy. But the biblical record suggests something much larger. Miriam was not simply adjacent to leadership. She was leadership. One of the most important pieces of evidence comes from a text written centuries after the Exodus events themselves. In Micah 6:4, God declares, "I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam." That verse is astonishing. Read it carefully. Miriam is not inserted as family decoration. She is named within a triad of divinely sent leaders: Moses, the national deliverer; Aaron, the priestly authority; Miriam, included beside them. For ancient audiences, naming mattered, placement mattered, narrative memory mattered. This is not casual mention. It is retrospective recognition of leadership significance. And once you see that verse, it becomes difficult to go back to the smaller version of Miriam many people assume. But what kind of leader was she? The clearest explicit title appears in Exodus 15, immediately after the dramatic crossing of the sea and the collapse of Egyptian military pursuit. The text names her Miriam the prophetess. That single title changes everything. In the biblical world, prophet was not a decorative religious label. Prophets were figures associated with divine communication, moral authority, communal guidance, and, at times, political consequence. The exact function of prophets varied significantly across biblical periods, which means we should avoid imposing later, standardized models backward onto earlier narratives. Still, the title itself unmistakably marks Miriam as someone with recognized spiritual authority. It is worth pausing here because modern readers often underestimate how unusual this is. The Hebrew Bible names relatively few women explicitly as prophetesses. Deborah is one, Huldah is another. Later tradition includes others in interpretive memory. But the canon itself is selective. Miriam's inclusion in that category is not accidental. It means the biblical tradition itself preserves her as a woman with recognized theological significance. Of course, this raises interpretive questions. What exactly did Miriam do as a prophet? The Exodus text does not provide long collections of her speeches the way later prophetic books preserve words from Isaiah or Jeremiah. That absence has led scholars to debate her precise function. Some suggest charismatic worship leadership. Others propose communal religious authority, especially among women. Some argue her prophetic role may have involved oral tradition, now largely unpreserved in written text. Still others suggest the title reflects remembered leadership status rather than specific documented prophetic oracles. Responsible analysis means acknowledging uncertainty, but uncertainty about exact function does not erase the significance of the title itself. If anything, it makes the preserved recognition more intriguing. Another important question concerns power structure. How exactly did leadership work among early Israel in the wilderness tradition? Moses clearly occupies the dominant mediating role between God and the people. Aaron emerges in priestly capacity. But where does Miriam fit? Micah's triadic remembrance strongly suggests a more distributed leadership memory than many simplified retellings assume. Moses was not necessarily imagined as a solitary operator, managing every aspect of national life personally. Ancient communities required layered leadership, especially in crisis migration narratives involving identity formation, worship structure, conflict management, and communal cohesion. Miriam likely functioned within that broader matrix. Her public leadership becomes especially plausible when viewed within comparative biblical context. Deborah serves as judge, prophet, and national military catalyst. Huldah authenticates divine revelation in royal reform context. Abigail demonstrates political wisdom in crisis negotiation. Esther alters imperial outcomes. The Hebrew Bible does not erase female agency nearly as completely as some assume. What makes Miriam distinctive is her chronological position. She stands near the origin story itself, before monarchy, before temple centralization, before later prophetic institutions became more recognizable in written form. That early setting makes her harder to categorize, but not less important. Some scholars have even proposed that Miriam may have represented a parallel or complementary stream of authority within Israel's early tradition, possibly linked with worship, communal memory, or gendered leadership roles less visible in later textual preservation. Such theories remain interpretive rather than definitive, but they highlight an important truth. Leadership in ancient communities was often more complex than modern readers expect. We should also resist the tendency to assume authority only counts when it resembles formal institutional office. Ancient influence could operate through charisma, ritual leadership, kinship legitimacy, prophetic recognition, or communal trust. Miriam appears to intersect several of these categories. Family connection alone does not explain her later prominence. Plenty of relatives of major biblical figures disappear into narrative obscurity. Miriam does not. She remains named, titled, remembered, and later central to major controversy. That pattern implies significance. Another revealing detail is how little defensive explanation the biblical text offers for her title. Exodus does not pause to justify why Miriam is called prophetess. It simply uses the term, as though the audience should recognize the legitimacy of the designation. That narrative confidence matters. It suggests remembered acceptance rather than contested novelty at the point of transmission. And perhaps that is what makes Miriam so compelling. She forces us to confront how much biblical memory can be compressed into sparse textual fragments. Modern storytelling often equates visibility with importance. Ancient texts did not always work that way. A brief title could carry enormous meaning. A single retrospective prophetic reference could preserve institutional memory. A figure with relatively few scenes could still have played major historical roles in communal imagination. By now, the cumulative evidence is difficult to ignore. Miriam is not merely the child by the river anymore. She is not merely Moses' sister. She is a recognized prophetic figure, remembered in national liberation tradition, positioned alongside the most important leaders of Israel's foundational narrative. And yet her most public moment is still ahead, because titles alone do not define leadership. Public action does. Soon, the nation will emerge from catastrophe, standing between the memory of slavery and the uncertainty of wilderness. And in that moment, Miriam will step forward, not in silence, but in song. There are moments in biblical history that feel almost cinematic in scale. Moments where survival, terror, faith, and memory collide in a single, unforgettable scene. The crossing of the sea is one of those moments. Behind Israel lies Egypt, the empire that enslaved them for generations. Before them lies uncertainty, wilderness, and the unknown future of a fragile people newly escaped from oppression. And between those realities stands a shoreline where history has just turned. Egyptian military power, the terrifying force that once seemed unstoppable, has collapsed. The people who spent their lives under domination now stand alive on the other side of catastrophe. This is not merely military escape. In biblical imagination, this is the birth of a nation. And in that defining moment, Miriam steps into full public view. Exodus 15 gives us one of the most significant scenes in her story. After the great song traditionally associated with Moses celebrating divine deliverance, the text introduces her with striking clarity. Then Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam answered them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." These verses are brief, but they are loaded with significance. First, notice the title, Miriam the prophetess. The narrative does not explain it. It simply assumes it. Her prophetic identity is already established enough to be stated without defense. Second, notice the action. She does not stand passively in the background, while others define the national memory of what just happened. She takes initiative. She leads. Others follow her. This is public leadership, not private devotion. And third, notice the medium. Song, music, embodied celebration. This matters far more than modern readers often realize. In the ancient world, victory songs were not casual entertainment. They were acts of communal memory formation, before widespread literacy, before national archives accessible to ordinary people. Song preserved history, music taught theology, ritual performance shaped identity. To sing about deliverance was to define what the event meant for future generations. In that sense, Miriam is not merely celebrating history. She is helping write it into collective memory. Some scholars have even debated whether Miriam's song fragment may preserve an older core tradition within the Exodus narrative itself, because her refrain is short, direct, and structurally powerful. Some have suggested it reflects an early victory chant, around which longer literary forms later developed. Such theories remain debated, but they underscore how central this moment may be in the tradition's formation. Whether or not one accepts those reconstruction arguments, the narrative itself clearly presents Miriam as publicly interpreting the meaning of national deliverance. The tambourine also deserves attention. Modern readers may imagine a lightweight musical accessory and miss the cultural significance entirely. Percussion instruments like tambourines or frame drums were associated with celebration, processions, ritual expression, and communal performance across the ancient Near East. Archaeological and artistic evidence from surrounding cultures shows women participating in musical celebration, especially in contexts of victory, worship, and public ceremony. Miriam's action fits recognizable ancient patterns, but what makes this scene extraordinary is not merely cultural familiarity. It is scale and timing. This is not a village festival. This is the defining liberation event of Israel's foundational story, and Miriam leads visible communal response. The dancing matters too. In many modern religious contexts, physical movement in worship can feel unusual or emotionally charged, but in ancient celebratory settings, embodied response was deeply normal. Dance communicated joy, victory, gratitude, and communal solidarity. It was not necessarily entertainment in the modern sense. It was symbolic participation in the meaning of the event itself. Miriam's leadership, therefore, combines theology, ritual, memory, and national identity in one public act. Another subtle but important question concerns why the text says sister of Aaron rather than sister of Moses in this specific moment. Scholars have proposed various explanations. Some suggest literary convention. Others think it may reflect source traditions or relational emphasis relevant to audience memory. Some note that identifying her through Aaron may subtly align her with priestly or familial leadership structures. Definitive answers remain uncertain, but the phrasing reminds us that ancient texts often preserve details whose full significance is not always transparent to modern readers. Still, uncertainty over that phrase does not diminish the larger point. Miriam is clearly being presented as a recognized leadership figure. There is also something profoundly human about this scene. Imagine the emotional reality. These are people who likely carry generations of trauma, fear, and subjugation in collective memory. Their worldview has been shaped by imperial power. Their future remains unclear. And yet, in this explosive moment of survival, the first public communal response led by Miriam is not strategic planning, not political speech-making, not military organization. It is worship through song. That tells us something about biblical imagination. Deliverance is not fully complete until it becomes interpreted, remembered, and ritualized. Miriam helps make that happen. From a leadership perspective, this is enormously significant. Not all leaders govern through commands. Some lead by shaping emotional meaning. Some stabilize communities through symbolic action. Some translate crisis into identity. Miriam appears to be precisely that kind of leader. Moses mediates divine confrontation. Aaron develops priestly institutional role. Miriam helps form communal memory through prophetic celebration. These are different functions, but not necessarily lesser ones. It is also worth noticing that women are specifically gathered under her leadership in this moment. Interpretations vary here. Some see gender-structured worship expression. Others suggest practical narrative framing rather than institutional separation. But, at minimum, the text clearly depicts Miriam mobilizing a visible public constituency. She is not acting alone. People follow her. That is leadership by any serious historical definition. This scene also deepens the irony of Miriam's story. The same girl, once watching silently beside the Nile, now stands before liberated people leading public celebration after Egypt's defeat. The river that once threatened Hebrew survival has given way to waters associated with deliverance. The child who acted quietly in crisis now acts openly in triumph. Narrative symmetry like this is rarely accidental in biblical storytelling. Miriam's story is being shaped with purpose, and yet, this moment, glorious as it is, does not represent the end of her journey. Leadership in biblical narratives is never measured only by triumphal scenes. The same woman who leads worship after deliverance will later stand in theological conflict, public vulnerability, and painful controversy. But that future should not diminish what happens here, because at this shoreline, Miriam is not a forgotten side character. She is a prophet, a public leader, a shaper of national memory, a woman helping teach a newborn nation how to understand its own survival. By this point, Miriam has risen from the shadows of the Exodus narrative into undeniable public significance. She helped preserve Moses in infancy. She emerged as a prophetess. She led communal worship at one of the most defining moments in Israel's history. But biblical narratives rarely allow leadership stories to remain uncomplicated for long. The same scriptures that preserve moments of triumph also preserve moments of fracture. And for Miriam, that fracture arrives in one of the most difficult and debated episodes in her entire story. Numbers 12 opens with startling tension. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Then the accusation deepens. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? Immediately, the narrative shifts from family disagreement into theological and political crisis. At first glance, the opening complaint appears straightforward. Miriam and Aaron object to Moses' marriage, but almost immediately, interpreters encounter major questions. Why mention the Cushite wife at all? Is this truly the central issue, or merely the surface trigger for a deeper struggle over authority? The text itself offers ambiguity, and that ambiguity has fueled centuries of interpretation. Let us begin with the marriage question. The term Cushite typically refers to a region associated broadly with areas south of Egypt, often linked with Nubia or Ethiopia in ancient geographic imagination. This has led some readers to interpret the complaint as ethnic or racial prejudice. That is certainly one possible reading, especially given how ethnicity and foreign identity functioned in ancient texts. But caution is necessary. The biblical narrative does not explicitly define the nature of the objection. Some scholars propose that the issue concerns ethnic outsider status. Others wonder whether the reference may connect to interpretive complexities involving Zipporah, Moses' Midianite wife, though this remains debated and textually uncertain. Still others argue that the marriage complaint may function primarily as narrative setup, rather than the true substance of the confrontation. Because the real accusation appears in the next line, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? This is not a marital complaint. This is a challenge to prophetic authority. And suddenly, the entire episode looks very different. Miriam and Aaron are not merely criticizing a family decision. They are questioning Moses' unique leadership position. That changes everything. One of the most compelling scholarly readings sees the marriage issue as either a catalyst or rhetorical entry point for a broader power dispute. In this interpretation, the deeper question is legitimacy. Moses has emerged as the dominant mediating figure between God and Israel, but Miriam is already identified as a prophetess. Aaron holds priestly significance, so the challenge becomes understandable. If God has spoken through them as well, why should Moses occupy uniquely elevated authority? This is not necessarily simple jealousy in the modern emotional sense. It may reflect genuine structural tension in a developing leadership community. Ancient societies rarely distributed authority without conflict. Competing roles, overlapping legitimacy, and ambiguous institutional boundaries often generated disputes. Seen this way, Numbers 12 becomes less a petty sibling argument and more a crisis of governance. And that makes Miriam's role especially fascinating. Notice something subtle but important. The Hebrew construction places Miriam first in the opening statement, while interpretive caution is warranted. Many readers have taken this to suggest that Miriam may have been the primary voice in the confrontation, with Aaron joining her. That possibility becomes even more intriguing given Miriam's established prophetic identity. If true, the conflict is not merely Aaron resisting Moses, it is one recognized prophetic leader confronting another. This is where Miriam becomes deeply human. Up to this point, viewers might be tempted to idealize her as the forgotten heroic woman of Exodus. But biblical storytelling does not sanitize its leaders. Leadership brings complexity. Authority invites tension. Strong personalities clash. Even legitimate leaders can overreach. If Miriam truly believed that prophetic experience entitled her to equal authority with Moses, the logic is not irrational from a human perspective. She had status. She had recognition. She had history. She was not a random outsider making baseless accusations, which makes the conflict dramatically richer. There is another layer worth considering. Moses is described immediately after the accusation as very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. Modern readers often stumble over this statement, especially because it appears in the narrative rather than as dialogue. Interpretive debates surround authorship questions and literary framing, but within the story world, the description functions as theological contrast. The challenge against Moses is not framed as justified correction against arrogant tyranny. The narrative prepares the audience to see Moses as uniquely positioned before God. That framing matters because it signals that, however understandable Miriam's perspective may appear sociologically, the text intends a theological judgment about authority. Yet, ambiguity remains. Was Miriam motivated by genuine concern, institutional frustration, personal resentment, boundary confusion, ethnic objection, leadership exhaustion? A combination of factors. The text does not fully resolve motive, and responsible interpretation should resist pretending certainty where ambiguity exists. Human conflict is often multi-layered, and ancient narratives can preserve complexity without full psychological explanation. What makes this episode so compelling for documentary storytelling is precisely that complexity. Miriam is no longer simply the girl by the river or the triumphant worship leader at the sea. She is now a powerful figure inside an internal leadership crisis. That transformation makes her far more historically believable than sanitized heroic caricatures. Real leaders are not made only of courage. They are also vulnerable to ambition, frustration, miscalculation, and flawed judgment. Theologically, this chapter also raises a profound question. What happens when genuine spiritual authority confronts greater authority? Miriam is not presented as spiritually irrelevant. Her prophetic title remains part of the biblical record. Yet, recognized authority does not automatically mean unlimited authority. Numbers 12 becomes, in part, a story about hierarchy within divine calling. Not every legitimate role is identical. Not every voice carries the same mandate, and confusion over those distinctions can become explosive. By the end of the chapter's opening movement, the atmosphere has completely changed. This is no longer celebration, no music, no dancing, no victory song. The leadership family at the center of Israel's national story is now fractured from within. And what happens next will become one of the most shocking moments in Miriam's entire life. Because the response will not come from Moses. It will come from God. The confrontation in Numbers 12 reaches its most unsettling moment, not when Miriam and Aaron challenge Moses, but when God responds, because this is where the story stops being merely a leadership dispute and becomes a theological reckoning. And, for many readers, this chapter raises one of the most uncomfortable questions in Miriam's entire story. Why was Miriam punished so visibly while Aaron appears to escape with far less consequence? If both participated in the challenge, why does the judgment seem to fall primarily on her? The text itself unfolds with dramatic intensity. Immediately after the accusation against Moses, the Lord summons Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting. In biblical symbolism, this is not casual conversation. The tent of meeting represents sacred encounter, divine authority, and covenantal presence. The atmosphere is judicial. God speaks directly, making a distinction that becomes central to the theology of the passage. If there is a prophet among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. But not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. The message is unmistakable. Miriam and Aaron may possess recognized spiritual roles, but Moses occupies a unique category. This is not a denial of their legitimacy. It is a clarification of hierarchy. In the narrative logic of Numbers 12, the core issue is not whether God has ever spoken through Miriam or Aaron. The text effectively grants that possibility. The issue is whether that shared spiritual experience places them on equal footing with Moses' singular calling. God's answer is no. Then comes the shock. The cloud departs. Miriam is suddenly described as afflicted, her skin becoming white like snow. Traditional English translations often use the word leprosy, but that language can be misleading for modern audiences. The ancient Hebrew term does not map neatly onto what contemporary medicine identifies as Hansen's disease. Biblical purity texts use terminology associated with a range of skin conditions, ritual impurity states, and symbolic bodily markers rather than precise clinical diagnosis in modern terms. So, we should be careful not to impose later medical assumptions onto the text. What matters narratively is visible affliction, public humiliation, and ritual exclusion. Still, the emotional force remains enormous. Miriam, once the prophetess leading national celebration, now stands physically marked before the leadership community. And this is where the troubling asymmetry emerges. Aaron was part of the confrontation. The text clearly includes him, yet Miriam bears the visible consequence. Why? Scholars and theologians have wrestled with this question for centuries, and no single explanation commands universal agreement. One common interpretation focuses on narrative grammar. As noted in the previous chapter, Miriam appears first in the accusation formula, leading some interpreters to conclude she was the primary instigator. If she initiated the confrontation, the disproportionate judgment may reflect perceived primary responsibility. This reading has some textual plausibility, though certainty remains elusive. Ancient narrative ordering can suggest emphasis, but not always definitive causation. Another explanation looks at symbolic roles. Aaron already occupies priestly office. A severe ritual affliction could complicate priestly function in ways the narrative may be avoiding for structural reasons. Some interpreters suggest Aaron's role required preserving institutional continuity, making Miriam the more narratively viable focus for visible judgment. This is possible, though somewhat speculative. Others propose theological symbolism rather than procedural fairness as the dominant concern. In biblical storytelling, visible judgment often serves didactic function. The purpose may not be symmetrical punishment distribution according to modern legal expectations, but dramatic demonstration of divine authority. Miriam's visible condition becomes a narrative sign reinforcing the seriousness of challenging Moses' unique status. This may explain the asymmetry without fully resolving modern discomfort. Some readers have asked harder questions. Is gender a factor? Was Miriam judged more harshly because she was a woman? That question deserves honest acknowledgement, especially given how sensitive modern audiences are to patterns of inequity in ancient texts. But the evidence here remains ambiguous. The Hebrew Bible includes examples of women exercising genuine authority and male leaders suffering devastating judgment. Numbers 12 itself does not explicitly frame punishment in gendered terms. That does not eliminate interpretive concern, but responsible analysis should avoid asserting conclusions the text does not clearly support. The ethnic interpretation of the initial complaint creates another possibility. If Miriam's objection involved prejudice toward Moses' Cushite wife, some theologians see poetic justice in visible bodily affliction, tied to symbolic impurity reversal. In this reading, discriminatory judgment rebounds upon the accuser. This interpretation can be rhetorically powerful, but it depends heavily on accepting the ethnic prejudice reading of the opening complaint, which remains debated rather than certain. There is also a deeper theological issue. Numbers 12 may not primarily be about interpersonal fairness at all. It may be about sacred boundary violation. In biblical theology, challenging divinely established roles could carry severe consequences, even when the challengers themselves held legitimate positions. Think of Korah's rebellion later in Numbers, where authority conflict becomes catastrophic. The theological worldview here is not modern egalitarian governance. It is covenant hierarchy under divine sovereignty. From within that narrative framework, the seriousness lies in crossing a boundary, not merely disagreeing, yet perhaps the most human moment comes immediately afterward. Aaron turns to Moses and pleads. Suddenly, the confidence of confrontation is gone. He acknowledges wrongdoing. He begs for mercy. And Moses, the very man who was challenged, intercedes for Miriam with one of the shortest and most emotionally direct prayers in Scripture. "O God, please heal her." That detail matters profoundly. Whatever institutional hierarchy the chapter establishes, Moses is not portrayed as vindictive. The conflict does not end in personal revenge. It moves toward intercession. God's response preserves both judgment and mercy. Miriam is not permanently destroyed, but neither is the consequence erased instantly. She must remain outside the camp for 7 days, echoing purity regulations and public consequence. That detail will become critically important in the next chapter. So, what is the final answer? Why did God punish Miriam? The most honest conclusion is layered. The narrative clearly presents divine defense of Moses' unique authority. Miriam likely bears primary visible consequence because of literary emphasis, symbolic function, or both. Additional interpretations involving ethnicity, institutional structure, or theological boundary enforcement remain plausible but debated. What is beyond dispute is the emotional and theological force of the moment. Miriam, one of Israel's most important leaders, discovers that recognized authority does not equal unlimited authority. Spiritual significance does not eliminate accountability. And one of the most powerful women in the Exodus story is suddenly standing outside the center of communal life, waiting to see whether restoration is still possible. After the dramatic confrontation of Numbers 12, after the accusation, the divine rebuke, the visible affliction, and Moses' desperate plea for healing, the biblical text delivers one of the shortest but most astonishing statements in Miriam's entire story. Numbers 12:15 says simply that Miriam was shut outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march till Miriam was brought in again. At first glance, this may seem like a small procedural detail, almost an administrative footnote following the larger drama, But when examined closely, it becomes one of the strongest indicators of Miriam's extraordinary importance in the entire Exodus narrative, because an entire nation stopped moving for her. To appreciate the force of that moment, we need to understand the world of the wilderness camp. This was not a modern town with stable infrastructure, where delaying activity for a week would be mildly inconvenient. In the biblical imagination, Israel in the wilderness was a vulnerable migratory community navigating uncertainty, scarcity, internal tensions, environmental exposure, and constant logistical fragility. Movement mattered, timing mattered, survival mattered. Delays were not trivial. A large communal encampment carried enormous practical demands: food coordination, water management, sanitation pressures, security concerns, social order, and ritual organization. Whether one interprets the numbers in the Exodus tradition literally, symbolically, or literarily, the narrative clearly imagines a substantial community whose movements were operationally significant. And yet the march stops. Why? The immediate procedural explanation is rooted in purity law logic. Miriam's affliction and exclusion fit broader biblical patterns in which certain bodily conditions required temporary separation from the community until restoration protocols were complete. God explicitly compares her exclusion to familial shame, suggesting a temporary but meaningful public consequence. On one level, the delay simply reflects obedience to divine instruction. Miriam remains outside until the appointed time concludes. But if that were the whole story, the wording would feel strangely emphatic. The text does not merely say Miriam completed her exclusion period. It specifically notes that the people did not move until she returned. That narrative emphasis invites interpretation. Ancient storytellers do not waste emphasis casually. This line tells us something about communal memory. Imagine if the text had moved on without mentioning the delay. Miriam's punishment would remain intact. The theological lesson about authority would remain intact. Yet, the author chooses to preserve this detail. Why preserve it, unless it mattered? One compelling interpretation is straightforward. Miriam's significance was such that the community's journey was meaningfully linked to her presence. This does not necessarily mean she held formal executive command over movement schedules. Ancient narratives often communicate status symbolically rather than bureaucratically. But the message is unmistakable. Miriam was not disposable. The nation did not simply move on without her. That becomes even more striking when contrasted with how quickly some biblical narratives move past fallen or disgraced figures. Here, after public judgment, Miriam is not erased, she is awaited. That matters theologically and narratively. Judgment did not cancel significance. Consequence did not erase belonging. Another profound layer concerns restoration. Biblical punishment narratives can sometimes end in destruction, exile, or permanent loss. Miriam's story does not. Her exclusion is temporary. Her return is explicit, and the community's halted movement dramatizes that restoration. In effect, the nation's pause becomes part of the story of reintegration. This is not merely punishment completed, it is belonging reaffirmed. Moses' intercession in the previous chapter already hinted at mercy. This chapter makes that mercy socially visible. The camp waits. Some interpreters see poetic justice here. Earlier, Miriam challenged leadership boundaries. Now, she experiences exclusion. But the same community, whose leadership structure was destabilized by conflict, does not permanently cast her aside. Instead, the narrative preserves both accountability and restoration. That duality gives the story unusual emotional sophistication. Historically, communal waiting also signals status. In ancient societies, time allocation reflects value. Whom does a community wait for? Whose absence matters enough to delay collective action? Leadership is often measured not merely by titles, but by the practical significance of presence. If the biblical tradition remembered Israel pausing for Miriam, that memory itself communicates honor, even if one resists reading too much formal structure into the event. The symbolic implication remains powerful. This woman mattered. Some scholars caution against overreading the detail, and that caution is fair. The delay may primarily reflect ritual necessity, rather than personal prestige. Responsible interpretation should acknowledge that possibility. The text does not explicitly say the people waited because of emotional loyalty or political dependence. It simply records the fact of delay. But even with cautious reading, the narrative effect remains remarkable. The story could have framed Miriam's exclusion as isolation ending in obscurity. Instead, it frames her return as the condition for resumed movement. That literary choice is meaningful. There is also a deeply human dimension here. Consider Miriam's emotional position. She has moved from prophetic leadership to public humiliation, from visible honor to exclusion beyond the camp. In ancient communal life, exclusion was not merely physical inconvenience. It carried symbolic shame, social separation, and existential vulnerability. To be outside the camp was to be outside ordinary belonging, and yet she knows the people have not left. Whatever tensions existed, whatever mistakes were made, the story does not leave her abandoned in permanent isolation. The nation remains present until restoration becomes possible. That detail transforms the emotional tone entirely. This chapter also complicates simplistic moral readings. If Miriam were merely a cautionary villain, the narrative would likely function differently. But she is not treated as disposable warning material. She remains a leader under discipline, not a rejected outsider erased from memory. That distinction matters enormously. Biblical storytelling often allows major figures to fail without denying their enduring significance. Moses himself will later experience severe consequence. Aaron will participate in profound failure. Miriam belongs in that same morally complex world. Leadership is not defined by flawlessness. It is defined partly by what remains true after failure. And what remains true here is astonishing. Israel waits. Perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of this moment. Not the affliction itself, not even the punishment, but the pause. A national journey suspended until one wounded leader is restored. For a woman so often reduced in modern memory to a supporting role, this single verse may say more than pages of commentary ever could. Miriam was not merely present in Israel's story. Her presence mattered enough that when she was absent, the nation did not move forward. After the dramatic rise of Miriam, after the courage at the Nile, the prophetic leadership, the triumph at the sea, the painful confrontation, and the extraordinary moment when an entire nation paused for her restoration, the biblical record does something almost shocking. It becomes nearly silent. Numbers 20 opens with stark simplicity. The people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there, and was buried there. That is almost all the canonical text gives us about the death of one of the most significant women in the Exodus story. No farewell speech, no dramatic final blessing, no extended mourning narrative, no poetic reflection, just a brief statement of death and burial. For modern readers, especially after tracing Miriam's extraordinary influence, the brevity feels almost jarring. How can a woman once named alongside Moses and Aaron receive so little narrative closure? But ancient texts do not always distribute emotional emphasis according to modern expectations. Sometimes silence itself carries interpretive weight, and in Miriam's case, That silence may be more revealing than it first appears. The first point worth noting is timing. Miriam dies at Kadesh during a critical stage of Israel's wilderness journey. This is not a peaceful epilogue after the story's major tensions have ended. The wilderness generation remains under pressure. Leadership burdens remain heavy. The community remains vulnerable. The death occurs within a still unresolved national narrative. In that sense, Miriam's story does not conclude in retirement. She dies inside the unfinished struggle. Then comes one of the most intriguing narrative connections in the entire story. Immediately after Miriam's death notice, Numbers moves directly into a severe water crisis. Now, there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and Aaron. The proximity is impossible to miss. Miriam dies. Then water disappears. Does the text intend readers to connect these events? The canonical text itself does not explicitly say so. That caution matters. We must not convert implication into certainty. Yet the narrative sequencing is striking enough that later interpretive tradition certainly noticed. This is where one of the most fascinating non-canonical traditions enters the discussion, the tradition of Miriam's well. In later Jewish interpretive memory, especially rabbinic tradition, Miriam became associated with a miraculous well or water source that accompanied Israel in the wilderness, sustaining the people because of her merit. According to these later traditions, Miriam's death explains the immediate water crisis, because the source connected with her disappeared when she died. It is a compelling symbolic tradition, emotionally powerful, and theologically rich. But historical clarity requires careful distinction. This idea does not appear explicitly in the Torah narrative itself. It belongs to later interpretive development, not the canonical biblical text. That distinction matters enormously. However, later traditions often emerge because interpreters perceive unresolved narrative tensions or symbolic patterns in the text. The fact that Jewish tradition linked Miriam with water is not arbitrary. Her life begins at the Nile. Her story intersects deliverance through water imagery. Her death is immediately followed by water crisis, symbolically. The association has literary logic, even if the explicit theological construction belongs to later interpretation. This makes Miriam's legacy even more interesting. Sometimes communities remember figures not merely through what the original text states, but through what the text invites them to imagine about significance. Historically, Kadesh itself carries weight. It is not an incidental location. Kadesh appears repeatedly as a place of crisis, testing, and transition in Israel's wilderness story. The death of Miriam here situates her final chapter within a landscape already charged with symbolic meaning. This is a place where the community's relationship with leadership and divine provision remains deeply unstable. In that sense, Miriam's death occurs not at narrative calm, but in an atmosphere of unresolved tension. Another striking element is comparative treatment. Moses' death later receives extended narrative attention, theological reflection, and explicit emotional framing. Aaron's death also receives more developed treatment than Miriam's. That disparity has led some modern readers, particularly feminist biblical scholars, to ask whether narrative compression reflects broader patterns of gendered visibility in ancient textual traditions. That question deserves serious consideration. Ancient texts emerged from patriarchal contexts, and women's contributions were often preserved less extensively than men's. At the same time, caution is necessary. Narrative brevity does not automatically equal insignificance. Some enormously important biblical events are recorded with startling concision, and Miriam's significance is established elsewhere in the canon, especially through Exodus. Numbers, and Micah. Still, the disparity remains emotionally noticeable. Perhaps the most compelling interpretive lens is literary, rather than procedural. Miriam's story has always been fragmentary. She enters through strategic action, emerges in symbolic public leadership, appears in crisis, disappears for stretches, then reappears at critical moments. Her narrative identity is built through flashes of significance rather than continuous biography. In that sense, a brief death notice is strangely consistent with how the biblical tradition has handled her all along. Miriam is never over-explained. She must be reconstructed from fragments, and perhaps that is partly why she remains so compelling. There is also something deeply human in the abruptness. Real life often does not provide neatly scripted conclusions. Not every important person receives a cinematic ending. Not every leader gets final speeches and ceremonial closure. Sometimes a life of immense influence ends in a line of text, while the community's practical struggles continue immediately afterward. That realism gives the narrative emotional force. The people still need water. Leadership crises continue. The journey goes on. Death interrupts. But history does not stop. Yet, if the text seems brief, communal memory clearly did not forget her. The later development of the Miriam's Well tradition strongly suggests enduring reverence. Communities do not invent sustaining symbolic associations around figures they consider trivial, whether one accepts those traditions devotionally or studies them historically. They testify to remembered significance. Miriam was not erased from interpretive imagination. She became larger within it, and perhaps that is the irony of her story. The biblical text gives her fewer words than modern audiences might expect. Yet her symbolic legacy expanded across centuries. The girl by the Nile became the woman associated with water itself. The prophetess who once led celebration became, in memory, a figure linked with communal survival. Canonical certainty and later interpretation must remain distinct. But both point toward the same conclusion. Miriam's influence did not simply end at Kadesh, even in silence. Her story continued to echo. By the time Miriam disappears from the biblical narrative, something remarkable has already happened. A woman introduced first as an unnamed sister watching from a riverbank has become one of the most significant female figures in all of biblical history. And yet, for many modern readers, Miriam remains strangely under-recognized. That tension between historical significance and cultural obscurity is exactly what makes her legacy so fascinating. Because Miriam's influence did not end with her death at Kadesh. In many ways, that is where her afterlife in interpretation truly began. If we ask what the canonical Hebrew Bible itself says about Miriam's enduring significance, the answer is already stronger than many assume. She is not remembered simply as Moses' relative. Micah 6:4 preserves one of the most extraordinary retrospective statements in the biblical tradition, where God declares that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were sent before Israel. That is not sentimental remembrance. It is theological recognition. Miriam is embedded in Israel's sacred memory as one of the principal leaders of the Exodus generation. That single verse alone permanently changes how her story should be read. She is not peripheral. She belongs in the leadership core of one of the most foundational narratives in Jewish and Christian scripture. Her canonical identity also remains unusually multidimensional. Miriam is not reducible to a single role. She is the girl who helps preserve Moses. She is the prophetess at the sea. She is the public worship leader shaping communal memory. She is the figure bold enough to challenge leadership boundaries. She is the woman publicly disciplined yet restored. She is the leader whose absence halts national movement. Few biblical figures carry that range of roles in such compressed narrative space. This complexity helps explain why later traditions found her so compelling. In Jewish interpretive memory, Miriam's significance expanded dramatically. Rabbinic literature often treats her with remarkable honor, not merely as a supporting biblical character, but as a spiritual force within Israel's formative story. The tradition of Miriam's well, though not canonical Torah text, reflects this reverence powerfully. Associating her with life, sustaining water transforms her from remembered leader into enduring symbol of divine provision. Historically, whether one studies this tradition devotionally or analytically, the interpretive message is clear. Miriam was considered too important to remain narratively silent. Communities filled the gaps not because she was forgotten, but because she mattered deeply. Jewish liturgical and cultural memory also continued to preserve her. In modern Jewish practice, some communities include Miriam's cup alongside Elijah's cup during Passover rituals, symbolically honoring female leadership and divine sustenance. This is not ancient biblical practice, but contemporary interpretive expression. Still, it demonstrates something significant. Miriam continues to function as a living symbol rather than merely an ancient textual artifact. In Christian interpretation, Miriam's legacy has been more complicated. Traditional Christian readings often focused overwhelmingly on Moses as lawgiver, foreshadowing theological themes connected with covenant, redemption, and Christological interpretation. As a result, Miriam sometimes receded into the background. Yet Christian scholarship increasingly recognizes her significance, particularly in biblical theology, women's studies, and historical interpretation. She offers a powerful case study in female leadership within scriptural tradition, one that complicates simplistic assumptions about women's invisibility in sacred history. Feminist biblical scholarship has played a major role in recovering Miriam's visibility. Scholars working in this tradition have asked hard but necessary questions. Why do some women with obvious importance receive fragmented narrative treatment? How do patriarchal textual cultures shape preservation? What happens when readers revisit canonical texts with attention to overlooked female agency? Not every feminist interpretation reaches identical conclusions, and some arguments remain debated. But the broader contribution is undeniable. Miriam has been brought back into serious conversation in ways that challenge generations of neglect. Historical scholarship has also deepened appreciation for her complexity. Rather than flattening her into inspirational simplicity, modern academic analysis tends to emphasize ambiguity, leadership structure, symbolic function, and textual layering. Was Miriam primarily a prophetic figure in the formal sense, a worship leader, a preserved memory of female authority, later compressed by textual tradition, a symbolic literary character representing communal dimensions of leadership? Scholars differ, but even disagreement reveals significance. Minor figures do not generate major interpretive debate. Another compelling aspect of Miriam's legacy is theological realism. Unlike idealized devotional portrayals that sanitize historical figures into moral cartoons, the biblical Miriam remains strikingly human. She is courageous, intelligent, influential, and spiritually significant. But she is also capable of conflict, misjudgment, and overreach. That complexity is not a weakness in the narrative. It is one of its strengths. Sacred history in the biblical tradition rarely offers flawless heroes. It offers consequential human beings navigating divine calling imperfectly. That makes Miriam more relatable, not less. Modern audiences may also find Miriam compelling because she embodies themes that remain timeless: leadership outside dominant narratives, the importance of overlooked contributors, the tension between authority and accountability, the power of women in systems not always designed to foreground them. the relationship between public significance and fragmented historical memory. These are not merely ancient concerns. They are enduring human questions, even outside explicitly religious interpretation. Miriam matters as a historical literary figure. She demonstrates how ancient texts preserve influence unevenly. She reminds us that narrative visibility and actual importance are not always identical. She challenges modern assumptions about who shaped foundational stories. Perhaps most importantly, Miriam's legacy forces us to well consider how we define greatness. Modern culture often celebrates singular heroic centrality, the lone, transformative figure dominating the narrative. But biblical history frequently tells a different story. Transformation emerges through networks of people, some highly visible, others partially obscured. Miriam belongs to that hidden architecture of history. Without her intervention at the Nile, Moses may not survive infancy. Without her public leadership at the sea, communal memory looks different. Without her role in national leadership, Micah's retrospective theology changes. Without her conflict, some of the Bible's most difficult reflections on authority disappear. Without her absence, Israel's halted march never becomes part of sacred memory. So was Miriam one of the most overlooked women in biblical history. The evidence increasingly suggests yes, not because the Bible erased her completely, it did not, but because later readers often failed to notice what was already there: a prophet, a leader, a survivor, a flawed human being, a woman an entire nation once waited for. And perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion of all. Miriam began this story standing beside dangerous water, watching history unfold. By the end, history itself is still watching her.